Welcome, everyone. My name's Kate Colvert. I'm the CEO of the national homelessness peak body, Homelessness Australia. So we're very excited to be hosting this event in partnership with the fabulous Dr. Elroy Dern from the RMIT Enabling Impact Platform and CHP Parity magazine. Before we continue, on behalf of Homelessness Australia, I want to acknowledge and pay deep respects to traditional custodians of this country. I'm joining from Wurundjeri country, and I pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and to all the First Nations people joining the event, recognising that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So I invite everyone to introduce yourselves to your colleagues and acknowledge the lands that you're joining from. So to give you a bit of context about today's webinar, it arose from a lot of conversations between Elroy and myself about the really shocking situations people find themselves in, trapped in private congregate accommodation like boarding houses or SRS, and the lack of options for people with psychosocial disability and other complex needs who are experiencing homelessness to get out of that kind of accommodation or to get out of homelessness into safe accommodation. But also the opportunities that are present at the moment with the reform that's happening in the NDIS and potentially in housing and homelessness. So we felt like there's a lot of problems that need to be solved, but there's also opportunities in the current context. And after a lot of conversations, we thought, look, let's take this dialogue into a more public conversation. So that's where we are today. So the other context is that Homelessness Australia is also a really big advocate for housing first models, which provide long-term housing and wraparound support to people who are experiencing repeat or long-term homelessness and need support to sustain their housing. And in February, we hosted a visit to Australia from a UK housing first expert, Joe Prestige from Homeless Link. And it became really clear talking to Joe how widespread supportive housing models are in the UK and how many people benefiting from housing first programs are actually being housed in supportive housing. Conversely, in Australia, these models are really scarce, and the funding that's available to create new opportunities to grow the amount of supportive housing that we have is very limited. But in recent years, a lot of people have gotten some of their support needs met through the NDIS. Now, that's all changing now because of all of the review processes. So there's reform underway in the NDIS, following from the NDIS review and also following from the Disability Royal Commission. But we've also had reviews into mental health, and we're soon expecting a 10-year national housing and homelessness plan. So there's a lot happening in the policy environment that impacts on the support and housing that might or might not be available for people experiencing psychosocial disability. And a lot of these reports have made recommendations that would actually improve the situation. I think it's really fair to say that the recommendations that are coming out of these reviews reflect really tireless and impactful advocacy that many of the people and organisations that are on this call today will have been really deeply involved with. So to give you just a sense of what some of those recommendations from those reform processes have been, what we heard from the NDIS review is that, there's really a problem still with these outdated group homes models. And from the Disability Royal Commission, we heard that people are being exposed to violence, abuse and neglect in these kinds of forms of congregate accommodation. And the Victorian Mental Health Royal Commission identified a really big gap for positive models of long-term supported housing for people with psychosocial disability, and reflected really strongly that that gap results in people's health deteriorating after they exit mental health care into homelessness or these forms of housing. So what we have is a situation where there's some consensus among all of these commissioners and policymakers who are writing these reviews. And broadly, they're calling for the same things as the community sector and the community of people with psychosocial disability have been calling for. There seems to be consensus that we need a rapid expansion of safe, inclusive and recovery-focused housing and support models, that there needs to be investment in tenancy sustainment, including for people in the private rental market, that it's time to phase down the large group home accommodation settings, that we need better rights and safeguards for residents who are in that kind of congregate accommodation, that we need better discharge planning and coordination from mental health and correctional, when people are in mental health or correctional settings, that in the homelessness sector, we would deliver better support for people if there were mental health specialists embedded in homelessness services, and that the national plans for homelessness, the national plan for mental health, and the national plans around disability should all be sort of reinforcing each other and not having people fall through the gaps, but providing a better response that sits across those different silos. So that sounds like it's a pretty positive situation, but it begs the question of why we haven't yet fixed these really big gaps. So I think some of the reasons that we still have these hurdles to progress is because these issues that we're trying to resolve sit at the intersection of multiple portfolios and of effort from different levels of government, and because politically governments aren't really very focused on people who are highly vulnerable, have psychosocial disability, and also experiencing homelessness. So that means it's pretty challenging to resolve the issues, but it isn't impossible. And this event today is part of Homelessness Australia's advocacy to achieve change. I'm going to say more about that at the end. But for now, having given you a sense of the opportunities in this policy environment and the challenges, we're going to hear from our fabulous speakers. So I want to first introduce Professor Lisa Brophy. Lisa is Professor and Discipline Lead in Social Work and Social Policy at La Trobe University, and Honorary Principal Research Fellow in the Centre for Mental Health and Community Wellbeing at the University of Melbourne. Lisa's research has focused on human rights, social justice, recovery and social inclusion, and contributing to making a difference for people who experience mental health issues and psychosocial disability, including on best practice models of supported housing. So Lisa, over to you.
Thanks so much for that lovely introduction, Kate. Much appreciated. So, as I said, thanks to Elroy and Kate and the rest of the team for inviting me to come and talk to you today and introduce you to models of supported accommodation for people with psychosocial disability. And I'm aware that these exist internationally, and there's a lot of discussion about the efficacy and gaps in these kind of models. And I've just been lucky enough to be overseas and hearing more about this. So, but first, I too would like to acknowledge that I'm meeting with you on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to Indigenous elders past and present, and to any Indigenous people joining us today. So when it comes to thinking about all of this, I really wanted to acknowledge my great colleagues. Professor Carol Harvey and I led a team who conducted a report for the Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health services, and that report is available from us, and if you would like to get a copy, I'd be happy to share it with you. And also Professor Helen Gillespie was part of that team, and she's an international expert. And I just heard her recently present at the Enmesh conference when I was lucky enough to be in France over July. And I'll be drawing a lot on her presentation there, which she generously shared with me. And Naja Abdel Salem, also from overseas. I had the privilege of meeting her when I was in Essex recently at a course, and she also shared her slides with me and told us a lot about the issues that they're faced in implementing Housing First in Lyon, and I'm going to share some of that with you. So a note on language. I'm using the language of researchers and research today, and mostly they're talking about mental illness or complex and persistent mental illness, but I'm really hoping that we can draw relevance from everything that we're talking about today to people living with psychosocial disability, although I do accept that they're not the same concepts. So basically, surprisingly, mental health supported accommodation is really under-researched, and it's very difficult to establish the evidence. And if we think about this internationally, around 70,000 people are living in mental health supported accommodation in England, 30,000 people in Italy. It's much harder to get a sense of that in Australia because we see people living across a number of different types of services in the NDIS, in clinical services in the NGOs, and unfortunately, lots of people living in our private supported residential services, lots more than we'd ever want to have. But we know also that this is costing many millions of dollars or pounds or euros. And one of the problems with research is that services are often poorly described and there's inconsistent terminology. So it's very difficult to know what this service actually is, how you might conceptualise it and how you might compare it with others. And the other thing that Helen talks about is the problem of the socio-political and economic context is often the key to whether these services actually work, but few studies actually take account of this. So if you think about a simple taxonomy for supported accommodation, now this is really interesting because this one is developed in the UK, but you can see how this is pretty relevant to us. So if you thought about type 5, this is probably how we might consider our current SRSs. Type 2 might be what I would think about as a CRU, a community residential unit in a mental health context. And then we have these other types as well. So that can be one way of thinking about supported accommodation. But housing first is very different. So when we think about housing first, what Nadia really explained is this is about skipping the shelter. And it's an alternative to having stable accommodation only as a result of a successful integration process. So you can see that in that traditional homeless services that involves different forms of temporary accommodation coupled with support and treatment being mobilised. And that's sort of to test the capacity of people to live in independent housing. And what has been found in the background to Housing First is that this often excludes disadvantaged people. And it also leads to an increasing number of temporary accommodation facilities rather than actually giving people accommodation that's enduring. And it really also can keep homeless people away from ordinary housing. It's also been argued that it's inefficient and costly. So here we see the possibility of skipping all of that and people going straight into regular housing with full tenancy rights in a housing first type model. And the aspirations and promise of a new paradigm to end homelessness is really where Housing First is coming from. And I loved this. I don't speak French myself, but I think this is a French example that we can all relate to. The person who says, well, if you don't touch a drop of alcohol for 6 months, if you show exemplary behaviour at the gymnasium this winter, and if you euthanise your 3 dogs, you'll be entitled to a ticket into the queue for social housing. In other words, people having to jump through all these hoops and prove themselves almost worthy of ongoing, enduring, safe and affordable housing, rather than this being seen as a right. The problem is that even though housing has been enshrined in French law for over 30 years as a right, it's been difficult to achieve in the context of all these temporary options being more likely to be funded. But Housing First is really described as a disruptive approach that challenges the boundaries and enables vulnerable people out to have an opportunity to get out of extreme precarity. So my colleague Piers Gooding wrote an interesting paper in Parity about Housing First and where Housing First may be coming from that's very different. So he talks about Housing First has helped improve standards for combining evidence and practice. Perhaps more importantly, it's helped challenge the myth of homelessness as a component of individual pathology rather than as an economic and social condition that is no more inevitable than it is irresolvable. In other words, we need to stop blaming homeless people for being homeless and start thinking about those broader conceptual issues. And far from denigrating mental health professionals, this observation may liberate service providers who are given the impossible job of supporting people whose housing insecurity undermines the provision of quality mental health support. Politically, such a reframing can help prioritise action and shifts the focus from sectoral to structural issues, and gives us a much better chance of supporting people in the long term, I think. So interesting, the preferences that people have for different types of supported accommodation. And again, Helen Gillespie has particularly contributed to this work, but here's a paper that talks about 84% of service users or consumers prefer more independent, self-contained accommodation, whereas carers and clinicians prefer service users to live in more supported accommodation, which is an interesting finding about different ideas about the value of autonomy. So there's mixed results for supported accommodation and housing first. And, you know, although I'm a big supporter of housing first, I think it's actually really worth thinking about what some of these more mixed findings are. And one of the things is that Housing First is excellent at enabling people to achieve housing stability, but sometimes it's not enough to prevent a more negative trajectory. And one of the ways that that's been responded to is having more peer specialists who can support more recovery-related outcomes. It's hard to find Housing First research, though, that actually investigates more recovery-orientated type outcomes. But there is kind of this evidence that Housing First, people in Housing First did experience significant improvement in community integration and recovery after 24 months. Now, Helen Gillespie, more recent work talking about the problem with Housing First for people who are not homeless is much less established. So if people aren't coming to Housing First because they're homeless, but because they've been caught up maybe in the hospital system, they've lost their accommodation and they need other options, it's much less well established whether those people going into a Housing First model are going to benefit. And maybe that's because there's variation in the amount of outreach support that's provided. And some studies refer to a model as Housing First, but what they described isn't necessarily Housing First. So I kind of looked at this and thought, well, what is a way of thinking about Housing First? And I actually found Naja's presentation really helpful where this was concerned. So what she talked about was the coexistence of three conceptions of Housing First. One was a sort of more targeted approach, and this is where the more original studies about Housing First, the pathways to homelessness in New York in the 1990s, and really a counter model for the most marginalised people and targeting them. And then a more extensive approach that's been trialled in Canada, the Shea Su program in Canada, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, where there's been much more translation and adaptation of Housing First to help it fit potentially for a number of different types of people with more different types of problems, particularly people with serious mental health conditions or psychosocial disability. And then you have this more transformative approach, which is more what's happened in Finland, which is a small country that made a determined effort to eliminate homelessness and had seen Housing First as a really important way to do this. One of the things that is also really interesting about Finland is that they have a relatively large supply of social housing, and they also applied a very broad definition of homelessness that included actually trying to prevent people from becoming homeless. So you will hear these fantastic outcomes for what they've achieved in Finland, but that has to be understood in terms of this broader commitment that they made as a country. So Nadia took us through some of the kinds of problems they've had in Lyon in France, where they've worked towards introducing a stronger emphasis on Housing First, and barriers to accessing housing things that we would probably understand, things about supply, administrative problems, people's financial situation not matching up very well with being able to have all the identification needs, all those kind of things that that are required for people to go into housing, insufficient institutional support to mobilise sufficient affordable housing. Interestingly, no alternative housing options for people who don't want to live in ordinary housing or don't want to live alone. And also in these few situations where there's been a crisis or there's been a difficulty, perhaps in a block of flats that has been given over to some Housing First, and without that kind of support being available to deal with those problems, partnerships have been weakened and potentially neighbours have been very concerned about Housing First being in their neighbourhood. So UK models of supported housing, and now we're talking specifically about people with mental health conditions in particular. We see these different models: residential care, supported housing, and floating outreach. Helen did a study where she compared the kinds of outcomes that people have achieved in these three different models. And after adjusting for differences between the service user characteristics, it was interesting that satisfaction with care was actually quite similar for the three different types of models, but autonomy was greatest for people in supported housing. Quality of life was similar for people in supported housing and residential care, but personal safety was worse for people in supported housing and floating outreach. So people may be trading sometimes that sort of personal autonomy with potentially being a bit more vulnerable and having greater risks to their personal safety. And, you know, when you think back to that slide that I showed you earlier about how carers and clinicians tend to favour more supported housing, more residential care, it may be because of those, you know, potential concerns about people's safety. So the Quest project looked at what happened as well at 30 months follow-up in terms of how many people had actually moved on from these different types of housing. So this is also very interesting. So 41% of people had moved on. So 2/3 in floating outreach were managing with less visiting support. So those people who had that bit more autonomy were the people who tended to do very well in terms of moving on. 1/3 in supported housing had moved on to less supported housing, but only 1 in 10 in residential care had moved to less supported housing. So residential care, that 24-hour support, tended to be a little bit longer and potentially even lifelong for some people. So again, this study got interested in what were the domains of care associated with people successfully moving on. So I hope you're following me now. We're talking about the idea that if people did move on from these different kinds of supported accommodation, what were the things, what were the features within these different types of services that help people to move on to more independent living? And this is actually measured by something called the QUIRK, which is a measure that you can use to look at the quality of residential care. And these, see what's come up here is these really interesting domains that are associated with people moving on. One is about recovery-based practice. So when you have that more recovery orientation, therapeutic optimism, you have more peer support, you're doing more individualised care, and you've got people more involved in running the service. And also you've got an emphasis on human rights. So you're respecting people's privacy and dignity, you're giving people access to advocacy, those kind of things. They're the kind of things that will actually help people move on to more independent living. So just in summary, the studies don't have really that much evidence of what's more effective types of supported accommodation over another. But these trials are very difficult to conduct. People prefer to live, generally most people prefer to live on their own in self-contained accommodation. So therefore, Housing First tends to be very attractive to people because of those preferences. But it's not the only model that's available, and we have to think about whether it is going to have the legs, you know, the teeth, if it doesn't have that more transformative approach that they've been able to apply in Finland. And also, what we also know is that these models are telling us that people need to more work in recovery-oriented ways and respect human rights. So there are also other findings that I think are interesting here when we're starting to think about what are good models of supported housing. People are wanting privacy, they're wanting stability, but there's a delicate balance between having privacy and dealing with loneliness, and there needs to be opportunities to support people to reconnect with their families, friends, and communities. And recently, a study on CCUs in Queensland also found that even in those 24-hour residential environments, there were many people who were moving on to improve quality of life and independence in the community, and were highly valuing the opportunity of those more slower rehab type services. So we looked at all of this in the context of thinking about optimal models of care and what we would recommend to the Royal Commission, that team that I originally was talking about, led by Carol Harvey and myself. And we were very clear that we needed to be thinking about what was culturally responsive, what would support recovery, what would respond to people with complex and multi-agency needs, what was going to be suited to the Victorian context. And we definitely recommended Housing First as a best practice model because it was effective for people and also cost effective. And we were already seeing examples of good research in Victoria that was supporting Housing First. But we also recommended two other types of supported accommodation. One was congregate housing first. So maybe that also deals with those issues about some people not necessarily wanting to live alone or not wanting to become lonely by living by themselves. And also for some people, we still felt that there was a place for high support accommodation. And so these were our conclusions. We thought there were quality features that underlie any kind of model of care or model of supported accommodation. We felt that those diagnosed with the most serious mental illness or people who had serious and persistent mental health issues, and maybe this translates to many people with psychosocial disability, we felt that Housing First Parks, having strength-based orientated models, self-directed and peer-delivered and peer-led models were really important. So definitely Housing First appeared there in our recommendations. And what we've seen from the Royal Commission is that they definitely have recommended supported housing for adults and young people living with mental illness. And they've recommended developing new bed-based rehabilitation services. I think one of the things that I want to say here is what are we going to do about the limitations of the ongoing use of supported residential, of our private SRSs. They are inconsistent with the evidence that I have just presented you regarding supported housing and accommodation. They're inconsistent with consumer preferences. They are conditional. People don't get the opportunity to feel safe and like they have safe, affordable and enduring housing. It's conditional for them. Those services tend to neglect human rights and they lack that recovery orientation that's going to enable people to move on to more autonomous living. They may form a substitute for the development of a network of supported accommodation options such as those available in the UK because they're tending to mask our lack of support of really good supported accommodation models. And as many of you may be aware, we're having people discharged from inpatient units into these services, and you could argue that that is grossly inappropriate. So they're masking the urgency of the situation faced by high rates of people with psychosocial disability who face homelessness. And finally, what we know, especially from Alroy's research, is that they do harm. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope that's been helpful.
Thanks, Lisa. There were so many insightful comments there. Really appreciate that. I'd like to really delve into that more now, but I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Elroy Dern, who guest edited the Parity edition on supported residential services and who's research fellow at RMIT University. So Elroy's research explores homelessness, institutionalisation, psychosocial disability and human rights. Elroy's worked in psychosocial rehabilitation and in homelessness, and has held senior policy and research positions in local, state government and the Victorian Office of the Public Advocate. So over to you, Elroy.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Professor Brophy. That was a fantastic overview of the evidence of the international literature on housing and support models, and it sets it up with a really great place to start today. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on whose lands I'm speaking from today, and pay my respects to Indigenous elders past, present and emerging, and to all First Nations people joining us. I'd also like to acknowledge anyone with lived experience of homelessness and psychosocial disability joining us, and I encourage you to ask questions of the panel in the chat. Professor Brophy's overview shows that there are models that can effectively support people into safe, affordable, non-institutional models of housing. The NDIS review and the Disability Royal Commission both highlight the changes needed to enable people with disabilities to choose from a range of high-quality living options. And with the Commonwealth response to the Disability Royal Commission being launched today, now is a really good time to be talking about resourcing models that can support people to move out of inappropriate settings. As Bill Shorten in his press club speech on the NDIS review last year said, the sixth big change involves creating fairer housing and living supports. Many participants don't get to choose where they live or who they live with. At best, this state of affairs is manifestly unfair. At worst, it risks condemning people with disability to segregated institutional life with minimal oversight. We cannot allow that to continue. Today, I have the pleasure of launching the special edition of Parity on private supported boarding houses, and I'll be introducing a panel of speakers who contributed to the edition. Before we go to the panel, I'd like to thank the Council to Homeless Persons for the opportunity to bring together writers and advocates across the country in this special edition. Thanks in particular to Noel Murray for the opportunity to be guest editor. The edition was made possible by sponsors Winteringham, the Mental Health Legal Centre and Wellways. And special thanks also to Brian Littman, Winteringham's CEO, who spearheaded the edition. And thanks to Homelessness Australia for bringing this launch together as part of Homelessness Australia's work on supported housing for people with mental illness. Private supported boarding houses, as they're collectively known, are medium-sized facilities accommodating a mix of vulnerable residents in an institutional model. These settings emerged nationally in the context of deinstitutionalisation to provide for people being discharged from institutions, and they continue to be relied on as a discharge option from mental health facilities and homelessness services. They are predominantly for-profit services. They provide basic accommodation and assistance with daily living, including meals, laundry, cleaning and medication, for a fee of around 85 to 95% of the disability support pension. In New South Wales, they're known as assisted boarding houses. In Queensland, they're called residential services level 3. In WA, they're known as psychiatric hostels. In Victoria, they're known as SRS. And in South Australia, they're called supported residential facilities. The environment incorporates single or shared bedrooms, shared bathrooms, kitchen and dining facilities. But because they don't provide the essential elements of home, in many instances, residents would meet the criteria for homelessness. While most residents have significant unmet mental health support needs, private supported boarding houses are designed with low staffing ratios and minimally qualified staff without specialist mental health training. There is no national figure available on the number of people living in these facilities, but there are hundreds of private supported boarding house facilities across the country. In Victoria, they house an average of 30 residents, with the largest accommodating 80 residents. The introduction of the NDIS has resulted in a range of exploitative practices in private supported boarding houses. What has been seen has been significant enough to draw the attention of the NDIS Quality and Safeguarding Commission. And the Safeguarding Commission has made SRS a national priority safeguarding issue for 2023-24. As my own research illustrates, these are segregated institutional models of housing, inconsistent with Australia's commitment under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities for people to be free from exploitation, violence and abuse, and not to be obliged to live in a particular living arrangement. Private supported boarding houses are a problem not just in Australia, but in other countries, including Canada, New Zealand and the US. In Canada, there's been a move to decommission their remaining boarding houses, which are known as custodial settings. And I'd like to share a quote from Pat Capone. She was a boarding house survivor and advocate. She described life in boarding houses in Canada in this way. People have had mirrored back to them their inability, vulnerability, and incapacity in almost all areas of their existence. The worst aspects of hospitalisation, the lack of personal control over the simplest activities, from bathing to meal preparation to socialisation. The inability to affect the rules and regulations governing them, the overly narrow lens used to define who they are and what they're capable of, the refusal to recognise the impact of poverty, isolation, and the social determinants of health ensure a broken population who will remain that way. And Pat was writing about her experience in supported boarding houses in Canada in the 1990s, but the situation in private supported boarding houses in Australia today is really little different. Our purpose with this edition of Parity was to bring contributors from around Australia together to show that the problem of private supported boarding houses is a national issue. The edition includes contributions from New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia and Victoria, including Victoria's Public Advocate, Dr. Colleen Pearce, and Queensland's Public Advocate, Dr. John Chesterman. Dr. Chesterman's report, Safe, Secure and Affordable, the need for an inquiry into supported accommodation in Queensland, was the report that triggered the recent Queensland parliamentary inquiry. The edition includes a piece from Winteringham, who write about finding pathways out of settings shut down by the Victorian government due to their failure to meet minimum standards, such as Meadowbrooks and Hambleton House. The Mind Australia piece similarly focuses on pathways out, highlighting the successes of the Haven model. The New South Wales perspective in the edition was provided by long-time advocate Sister Myree Harris, who writes about her 2 decades of advocacy efforts in the assisted boarding house space. The South Australian experience is documented by Alice Clark from Shelter South Australia. Thank you to these and all our other contributors who have made this edition of Parity a significant document that will be there to support our advocacy efforts going forward. In bringing together these perspectives, this Parity edition is the first time this problem has been recognised as a national issue. And I'm very happy to be launching this special edition of Parity on private supported boarding houses and SRS today. Victoria's Public Advocate is unfortunately unable to join us today and offers her apologies. Instead, I'd like to warmly welcome Daniel Layton, Victoria's Deputy Public Advocate. Daniel will highlight the violence, abuse and neglect experienced by residents living in SRS and how the NDIS context has exacerbated these concerns. Neil Turton-Lane, lived experience workforce lead at Better Health Network, will speak to the need to provide residents with better advocacy and support to gain the resources, skills and confidence needed to find pathways out of institutions. Tanya Atkinson, Research, Evaluation and Policy Manager at Winteringham, and Mark Heaney, Executive Director, Housing Strategy, Mind Australia, will speak to examples of models that provide pathways out of institutional settings into non-segregated options. I'm now going to hand to Daniel Layton, after which we'll hear from each of the other speakers. Each speaker will speak for 5 minutes. This will be followed by question time, so please put your questions in the chat And we'd particularly like to hear from people with lived experience and people from other states.
Thank you, Elroy, and good morning, everyone. Let me begin by also paying my deep and personal respects to Elders past, present and emerging, and let me begin by thanking the Council to Homeless Persons for dedicating an edition of Parity on supported residential services and homelessness. And as Elroy has already stated, I'm speaking on behalf of Dr. Colleen Pearce, the Victorian Public Advocate, who's unwell today. And I can let everyone know that the Public Advocate was delighted to provide an introduction to Chapter 1, and as Chair of the Victorian Community Visitors Residential Services Board, along with board members David Stafford and Brian Greben, contribute a piece containing observations from community visitors' visits to SRSs across Victoria. And in the Public Advocate's introduction, she wrote that the SRS model does not align with the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Article 19, and that being the right to live independently and be included in the community. And that follows on from OPA's submission to the Disability Royal Commission on this topic in 2022, where the office observed that the conditions in some SRSs are arguably inconsistent with a number of other convention rights, as Elroy has just noted, including the rights to freedom from exploitation, violence and abuse, respect for privacy and adequate standards of living and social protections. And I'm actually going to quote from Elroy's PhD research now, where she contended that very few people living in SRSs actually choose to live there. Some SRSs try to provide everyday choices in things such as meals and outings, but very few allow for pervasive aspirational choices in areas such as health, housing, education, employment, and financial control. And I absolutely agree with this. SRSs are not settings in which it's usually possible for residents to achieve a full and flourishing life, one that's characterised by choice or social inclusion, and even where there are additional NDIS funds provided to eligible residents. And it is the typical institutional design approach, as Lisa has already outlined this morning, that impedes these positive outcomes. OPA very much supports the vision of the NDIS, and many people with a disability have benefited from this new funding model. However, in our work as appointed guardians alongside people living in supported accommodation, we have observed all too often that this system was not designed with sufficient safeguards against personal exploitation, nor against fraudulent behaviour. And evidence and findings of the NDIS review and the Disability Royal Commission and numerous joint standing committees on the NDIS support our claims. In OPA's experience, examples, as Dr. Dern has already described, Hambledon House, are not just bad apples of an otherwise functioning system, but evidence of a broader systemic design issues and of market regulatory failure. Abuse, neglect, and exploitation thrive where there's a power imbalance that enable opportunity, secrecy, and the possibility of profit. And it's these issues that are being exploited to facilitate poor practices. The viability of the SRS model has been extended through the introduction of the NDIS and is monetised by SRS proprietors with detrimental consequences for some of the most vulnerable residents. Community visitors and the position of the Public Advocate are part of a complex and inconsistent safeguarding and regulatory interface between the NDIS and SRSs, with an increasing number of actors with a role to play in the safeguarding of SRS residents, but no clear division of responsibility between the SRS and the patchwork of regulators where the NDIS and other systems play a part. Better information sharing between my office and similar offices nationally, and recognition and understanding of the role of community visitors is one that is needed within the NDIS Act and its quality and safeguarding framework. And in the absence of signposting and investment by governments in a range of safe models of suitable housing, graduating to accommodation and models of choice remains a dream that will not be realised for residents of SRSs. So in the meantime, SRSs continue to exist as a last resort in an imperfect system, and as such, additional oversight, including in frontline community safeguards and effective regulation to prevent exposure to violence, exploitation and neglect is essential. Back to you, Elroy.
And you covered a lot of really important issues there. And I encourage people to read the Public Advocate's introduction to the parity issue. Mark, would you like to contribute now, after which we'll hear from Neil, who's going to pass to Tanya, and then we'll move to questions and discussion. Please put your questions in the chat, please.
Thanks, Elroy, and a pleasure to be here, everybody. I'm just going to quickly share my screen, and I have actually slightly changed my presentation. I think in the context of what some of you may have seen today, there's been some massive news that the federal government's response to the Disability Royal Commission has come out, and I think in the context around the amount of instances that we see people living within private congregate care settings, SRSs, being abused and neglected, I think it's really important that we touch on some of those changes that have come out from the DRC. Sorry, I'm just trying to move the slide, the Disability Royal Commission's response. So I've literally just put this together in the last few minutes because it has really just been an hour that has come about, but of the actual recommendations that has come out from the DRC, there's 117 that have been accepted in principle, 13 that have been accepted within its full, and then 36 recommendations where there's no position on as yet. What's really important for, I guess, this group and what will be of interest to the audience is around the response in relation to inclusive housing. So we know that the Disability Royal Commission received a huge amount of evidence and responses in relation to people with a disability being abused and neglected within care. And some of these responses, which need to be looked at in a lot more detail, is what the federal government have brought out. So we can see that there's going to be a prioritisation with people in key national housing and homelessness approaches. Unfortunately, that's just accepted in principle, including homelessness in Australia's disability strategy, which has been accepted. And you can, I won't read out all of them, but I think you can just read them all there around what some of those areas are that the government are looking to accept. I think that on first glance, I was a little bit surprised that there's not as many accepted in full compared to just accepted in principle. And I think that that requires our community as a whole to really look at this over the next few weeks. The states and territories won't be putting out their response for a little while. However, I think that it's upon us to really consider what the investment and changes are going to be. What you can see, just the bottom left-hand corner, is that there will be a $49.7 million investment into the design and consultation to support better home and living options for NDIS participants as well. So again, we recognise that's really important for people living in an SRS and the pathway out as well. All of this is on the Department of Social Services website, so encourage people that are interested to also have a look. So I'll just talk a little bit around what some of the investment is in new social housing across the country and how this social housing can be an option for people who are currently living within private accommodation settings. And then I'll talk a little bit around what some of the current programs are. So really the support that actually accompanies the level of new homes that are built across the country. So we know within Victoria, we went through the big housing build. We also went through the process of the Royal Commission into mental health services within Victoria. And as a result of that, there was quite a significant level of investment in social housing including 500 new homes, which was specifically for people experiencing significant mental health issues as well. So a lot of those homes are being built at the moment. However, we still do see gaps around what the actual support is to help people to sustain their tenancy once they've actually moved within their home, particularly as we're seeing some erosion of NDIS funding across the country as well. Just a couple of months ago, the New South Wales government have announced $5.1 billion into social housing, which is going to create 30,000 new homes. In Queensland, there's been quite significant investment, and probably those 3 states where there is the most. And I think on top of that, there's the Housing Australia Future Fund, where there is $10 billion worth of investment into social and affordable housing. One of the key messages with all of this investment, although it's great, it will take a lot of time. One of the areas is, well, how do we ensure that this new social housing is actually going to be there to meet the needs of people that might be living within private congregate care settings? How do we ensure that we can lobby and advocate government to ensure that there can be an area that is sliced off to ensure that there can be that pathway out, as well as that investment in support so people can actually be supported to sustain their tenancy as well. So that, I think, is something that we are all waiting for, particularly as part of the National Housing and Homelessness Plan. However, we know that the housing crisis impacts so many people all across different corners of the country, but it's around how do we ensure that that pressure is applied, that there is a level of priority provided to some of our community's most vulnerable people.
Mark, we might have to leave it there. I know
Yep.
you've got a few more slides, and we're going to run out of time for
Yeah,
the
no
panel.
worries, no
So
worries.
look, great to hear from you, and thank you for including those insights from the government's response to the DRC at short notice. So we're going to go to Neil now, and then we'll pass to Tanya. So if you could go now, Neil.
Hi everyone. My name is Neil Lane. My pronouns are he, him. I'd like to acknowledge the custodians of the land on which I'm joining you today, the Wurundjeri Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. I'd just like to begin. I'd also like to thank the organisers of this event, the Council for Homeless People and the editors of Parity for the opportunity for lived experience perspectives to be included in this really important dialogue about housing, human rights and support for people with a disability. Can I begin just by saying that safe and affordable housing for people with a disability is a real cornerstone of human rights under the UNCRPD, and with safe housing comes better health, empowerment and a chance to connect with others, all things which are essential for human beings to live and grow. I'm here to talk very briefly about the article I wrote for the edition of the Parity magazine, which is being launched today. No Other Options, Supported Residential Services and Private Supported Boarding Houses and Homelessness. I am a person with a lived experience of mental ill health, homelessness and living in institutions, all of which have left a mark on me. I'll be upfront and say that I've never lived in a SRS, but you know, when I started working in SRSs, I recognised and deeply related to the institutional mould on which they are based. Yeah, so I'm also here today to discuss what support and then advocacy looks like for pathways out of settings like SRSs. Boarding houses, psychiatric hostels. What is it that we need to change? And there are many changes that need to happen, but from a lived experience perspective, these very much include peer support, you know, that is based on housing first principles around connection, being with a person, time, giving a person time, dignity and respect to begin to talk about their way out or what they want to do in their life. So many people living in SRSs are very isolated, often bedbound, or just totally shut down. And there is something about living within such an institution that kind of like generates that despair and that lack of hope. So having people come in who have had the lived experience of kind of homelessness and mental ill health is, I think, a really good way of kind of like generating hope within the residents in those facilities. I think another important factor is advocacy led by residents of SRSs and kind of generating ways for that to happen. I think the voices of SRS residents haven't been heard, apart from the great work that Elroy's done, but in general, like we're talking about a silent population that has had no voice and no recourse to speak up on their own behalf. And there are many reasons that, like many people will be aware of why it's actually dangerous to speak up while you're in SRSs. So, I'd really like to see a creation of a national body that kind of supports people who have been who have lived in SRSs or private congregate care to be able to talk about what the very issues are that kind of like continue to kind of like suck the life out, suck, everything out of their lives and kind of, create that sense of hopelessness that so many people have when in those settings. I'd also like to see lived experience research and to see what would happen if we kind of like start collecting data from people and stories from people that kind of based on what the actual problems are rather than what we imagine the problems are for people in SRS as well, the challenges that people face in living in private congregate care. Do some people like living there? Well, yes, we know that some people do, but what are the actual challenges and what are the steps that people need to actually make that move rather than have assuming that we know we have that knowledge already when we don't. How am I going for time, Elroy?
Pretty good. I think you're kind of about there, Neil, if you
right.
want to stop. Do you have anything else you would like to say right now or just wait for questions?
Look, I just like one thing is like, I'd just like to challenge that the assumption that serious mental illness and psychosocial disability are one and the same thing. I don't believe they are. I believe that the way back from ill mental health is very different to the support that people need to live with the daily impact of psychosocial disability in their lives. And I think, I think it's really important that we can keep those two very important concepts kind of like separate, but, understand they are relatable. Thank you, Elroy.
Thanks, Neil. That was fantastic. And thank you for sharing your personal experience as well and insights that come from that. And you really underscore the importance of hearing from a population of people whose voice has not been listened to. People are there ready to say something. It's just that the voice has not been heard. So that's a really important point going forward. We're going to hear from Tanya now, and then we'll move to questions and discussion.
Thanks, Elroy. So I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in which we're all virtually attending this meeting from today. I'm attending from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. Just very quickly, for those who've not heard of Wintringham, we work across Tasmania and Victoria, and we deliver aged care services housing services, homelessness services, and a very small amount of NDIS services to people aged over 50 who've had an experience of homelessness or been at risk of homelessness. So our client population there's a lot of crossover between the people that Wintringham supports and people who are often living in SRSs and perhaps wish that they weren't. So a lot of our clients have had long experiences of social isolation. We have a lot of clients who have alcohol-related brain injuries and psychosocial disabilities and complex mental health conditions. I'll touch on a little bit. Wintringham's been involved. We wrote an article about this Parity in the closure of 3 SRS facilities in Victoria. So the state government closed them each for different reasons, but essentially the residents were receiving incredibly poor levels of care and the accommodation was in a pretty terrible state. And we came in to deliver care to the residents after the owners had been removed and saw substantial evidence of abuse and neglect that was occurring within these facilities. So our role was to support the residents while provide them with their day-to-day supports and then also look to alternate accommodation options for the people that were living in these SRSs. And I think what we were able to demonstrate is there are some options out there, but, and I think as Neil really touched on, people living in SRSs are often so disconnected from the community. They're not able to access the supports that they need to then find more suitable types of accommodation. So we were able to move a number of people living in these 3 SRSs into residential aged care. So I'll talk a little bit about what that probably needs to look like for people, older people living in SRSs. So Wintringham runs residential aged care that is very specialised. So I don't think we're suggesting that every aged care service is going to be a good match for people living in SRSs. But we know across Australia there are providers delivering very specialised aged care that meets the needs of people who are, you know, our client cohort is a much younger client cohort. Our client cohort are out and about in the community a lot more than you would probably see at a traditional aged care service. And so a lot of the older residents living in the SRSs were able to move into Wintringham Resi Care and see that they were with their people. Things like the building design and the lack of institutionalisation in the delivery of care are really critical. But I think if we think about what we need to do moving forward, we need to ensure that aged care remains flexible enough to deliver flexible supports to diverse client cohorts, and we don't get to a point where aged care service delivery is focused solely on more mainstream and traditionally ageing members of our community, because we know that people who've experienced homelessness will age prematurely and have that accelerated pathway to frailty. So there is a need for aged care supports within this area of work. The other thing that we think works very well is a supportive housing model. So the idea, we have an example of it that's fully funded by the Victorian State Government, very fortunate to have, and it delivers 24-hour support with case management, recreation, and an overnight concierge. So there's someone on site all day, and we bring in home care services through aged care and NDIS supports. And so I think more of that style of accommodation needs to be available to meet the needs of people who need some support and can work in partnership with other supports. I'm conscious that I've probably reached my 5 minutes, but I wanted to touch on, because we also run an SRS and its rent alone is not adequate to fund the supports required. We've been fortunate to get a little bit of philanthropic grants to support a case management service navigator role, as well as very strong community partnerships. And when I was thinking about the key themes across the services we deliver and the services we refer other clients to, that the need for service navigation, so that case management role, the support to help people navigate, because our systems are not well designed for many people to navigate. And that's probably the really consistent theme, is ensuring that when we're delivering a service, we're also outwardly looking to what's available in the community. How do we get people into aged care get the right NDIS supports in place. So I think that's a really critical component of service delivery. You're on mute, Elroy.
Sorry, guys. Yeah, that was a great overview, Tanya. We might move to questions now. I have a question for Daniel Layton. Just wondering, Daniel, whether Victoria is likely to go down the track of Queensland in calling for a parliamentary inquiry into SRS, and whether this is something that the public advocate will be calling on the Victorian government to do.
Oh, thanks, Elroy. Look, at this stage, I think it's a bit premature to call for a parliamentary inquiry in Victoria, particularly as Mark and others have highlighted the release of the Commonwealth Government's response to the DRC. We'll be taking our time to understand and consider which of the 130 recommendations they've accepted in full or in principle. And as I recall, there was 220 odd recommendations, and many of which they're interconnected. And, you know, this really is a difficult space. We also want to see how the Victorian government responds in time. I think on top of that, we also need to consider the response to the NDIS review. It's not just the words on a page, though. There's a huge difference, as everyone on this call knows, between lived values and espoused values, and the lived experience and the written word. So it's one thing to get the responses, it's another thing to get what's actually delivered. We'll want to see what some of the actions begin to look like. So it might be that a parliamentary inquiry is required at a later date. I'm just saying not right now. In the meantime, I'd reiterate that SRSs are operating in this cross-cutting environment. So we need to be attuned to the trends and opportunities that exist. And so I think it's really important that we start to identify and invest in better practice models, which are and can be a meaningful and practical solution for people who need to access safe, supported housing. And that should be occurring, you know, yesterday.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm going to go to Neil now. I wonder, Neil, whether you could talk about the supports, the types of supports needed to help people make decisions about their housing choices, particularly people who have lived long-term in institutional settings such as SRS.
Yeah, thanks, Elroy. Look, you know, I do believe, you know, like, you know, again, some of the principles of housing first, you know, are needed, you know, like just and they include like relations, trust, kind of like building building that dialogue with people, getting people to listening to people. Oh my God, you know, it's so something we do so little of, but actually listening to people, giving people a chance to speak, and then a chance to articulate what they want. And you know, for many people, that will be like buried under so much kind of clutter and debris, you know, that it's so important. You know, I think you know, like I feel continuity, relationships, trust, you know, understanding that, you know, like, you know, you're working with a group of people who have been through significant trauma and loss, and you know, and won't have a great level of trust towards like providers or people coming in from the outside. So, you know, you really need to establish that and to get people to understand that you're there to help them. You know, you're working with them and not trying to fix their problems. Yeah. I think all those skills, I feel, you know, many of those skills are skills that, you know, you see in peer support, in the principles of peer support, as kind of like, yeah, so I do see some, you know, like potential for people with lived experience, you know, to act in these roles and help, you know, start generating kind of conversation and thinking for residents.
Thanks, Neil. I'm going to go to Mark now. Mark, I wonder if you could outline the types of changes that are needed in the funding landscape, in particular the NDIS, to ensure that people have adequate funding for support to live in models like Haven. If you could make it a 2-minute answer, that would be great. I know you could do that in half an hour.
Thanks, Elroy. When Elroy's note of Haven, so Haven is an integrated social housing with psychosocial support program that Mind Australia and the Haven Foundation as a community housing provider provide. So I think, firstly, the NDIS has made an incredible change to people's lives to be able to be supported within the community. And I think is being able to continue to do that, particularly for people with quite significant psychosocial disability who require that long-term support to sustain their tenancy and stay out of hospital. And we know within the Haven model that evaluation that La Trobe Uni undertook, led by Professor Lisa Brophy, is that we saw an 86% reduction in hospitalisations because of that. And a lot of that is just due to the investment of the NDIS. However, I think since the introduction of the NDIS, we have seen some states and territories sort of move a little bit away from some of their responsibility of providing long-term support programs. We know that within Victoria, there's some great housing first models. There's the Doorway program, there's the Journeys to Social Inclusion. We have HASI in New South Wales. We have HASP in Queensland and South Australia. However, we do need long-term and more investment in those spaces so we can ensure that there can be those multiple pathways out of SRS environments, because not everybody will need the NDIS. However, some people will still require some long-term support based on what their psychosocial disability or their significant mental illness is, to use Neil's point around trying to differentiate between the two. Thanks, Elroy.
Thanks, Mark. We're going to go to Dr. John Chesterman now, who is the Queensland Public Advocate, who has a question for the panel. You'll need to just unmute yourself, John.
Yeah, I think I've done that.
Yep.
All right. Thank you very much, and great to see you, a former staff member. I moved from academia to paper 15 years ago. You've done the opposite. Well done. And it's terrific to see your work, and great to see a number of people I haven't seen for some time, including Daniel, Lisa, Neil, and others. Just on Neil's point about lived experience, I'll put it in the chat. One of the real strengths of the Queensland Parliamentary Inquiry is that they took up a suggestion I made about engaging in an NGO to get the voice of people of current and former residents. And in fact, they engaged 2 NGOs, and we're going to see, there's reference to this in the edition of Parity, but we're going to see this play out over a longer period of time. We hear so much about choice, so actually hearing what residents want, I think, is very important. So I'd be suggesting all sorts of ways in which people might look to their state and territory governments to encourage the funding, perhaps of 1 or more NGOs to do just that. Thanks, Elroy.
Thanks. Thanks, John. Would anyone like to comment on that? Daniel, do you have perhaps a comment on that? Or I guess Tanya, you might have some thoughts, given all of the work you're doing around, you know, supporting people to move out of institutional settings like Hambleton House and Meadowbrooks that have shut down, on how we might put together a method of consulting with residents.
I'll quickly say while Tanya pops up that OPA is very supportive of the model that John's just described, and go a little bit further, that OPA has recommended, and people might be aware of some of the stories that were on Four Corners earlier this year. The Public Advocate has recommended that that people who are subject to guardianship be able to speak publicly and not be unable and remain silent. We have absolutely no issue with that level of transparency. So we're wholeheartedly supportive of any approach. Over to you, Tanya.
I think when I think about this question, there's really 2 different things that need to be done. And so at a very on the ground level, there's listening to individuals and supporting them to navigate the choices that currently exist and recognising that there are major gaps in our system to deliver the supports that some people need. So I think something that was a pretty consistent theme for us is finding a range of supports that can deliver the clinical health supports that someone needs, perhaps alongside mental health and psychosocial disability supports. We don't have a lot of options in that space for people who are physically frail and also have long-term mental health condition. I think that there's so much we could be doing to look to the future of service design. Like when Mark, it was lovely to see that dollar figure to looking to the future of housing options and housing models, because I think that's our opportunity, isn't it? Like if we're going to put money into developing new funded housing and support models, we should be engaging with people who currently live in SRSs to understand what bits of the SRS do they like. We interviewed a client as part of the Parity and edition, and he spoke really clearly about the bits that he loved about living in an SRS and the bits that he really didn't like about living in an SRS. And I think that'll be the case for so many people. There's things that are really lovely about living in a community that perhaps we want to capture, and the bits that we really, really do not want to continue. So
Thanks, Tanya.
Yeah.
Sorry, thanks, Tanya. That was a great question, John. And look, we're just running out of time for the panel now, and we're ready to hand over to Kate. So I'd really like to thank Daniel, Mark, Neil, and Tanya for presenting today. And people will have seen that the Parity edition is now in the chat. So feel free to access that electronic copy of Parity. And Kate will talk us through where to from here and some of the recommendations coming out of their work. So over to you, Kate.
Thanks so much, Elroy. I'll just share my screen again. Can I just check, is that in
Your
slide
notes
view?
are there.
Okay. Sorry.
That's it.
So a big thanks to everyone who's contributed to the conversation, all the speakers, but it's also been great to see the questions and comments coming through. I think it's really, the conversation's really clarified what needs to change and signposted what we should be aiming for. And I think I've also really appreciated the fact that we've shone a light on the bright spots, the things that are working and that can be upscaled. So some of those things are those innovative models that Wintringham and Mind have spoken to that piece together supports and funding from a cocktail of sources. So housing, often from social housing, resourcing, homelessness support, NDIS funding, mental health funding, or dedicated funding streams, particularly hearing that through the Wintringham model for a particular supported housing approach, or also bringing in aged care funding. So these kinds of models resemble what we're striving towards, and I think we also heard from Lisa more about what those models should look like. So the question now is how we move forward so these kinds of models can be developed at scale. And as I was saying before, it's times like now when there's a lot of reform happening, when old approaches can be undone and new models can surface. So we have that broad consensus that I talked to before about the changes that are needed. So the advocacy that Homelessness Australia is working on is focused on navigating a pathway through all this reform so that we can achieve a better future. And I want to acknowledge the great work of Nicole Rees from Policy Fox Consulting, who's working on this advocacy with Homelessness Australia, and also acknowledge the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation for resourcing the work. So the two primary outcomes that we're heading for is that there's funding available to create the new forms of housing and support that would enable people to live a good life, and also that people's rights are protected. So how we get there is not about recreating the policy wheel, but it's about joining the dots. And this is sort of represented on the slide that I'm showing you. So we're focused on highlighting those reform recommendations that I spoke to before and joining the dots between them, and having putting pressure on government to have some accountability to progress the recommendations that they've heard from all of the different review processes. We also focused on harnessing opportunities in the reform processes to shape the design of new housing and support models that'll work, and continuing to build the momentum for change. So what are those opportunities? I just want to talk through briefly where I see those opportunities in this reform landscape. So we've got the NDIS 2 reforms, which has the potential to deliver, and probably I should say, I'm not saying that these will be easy to achieve, but this is kind of what the prize through all of this reform process could be if we can navigate a pathway to achieve it. So the NDIS 2 reforms potentially could deliver the inclusion of housing-related supports in the early intervention pathway for people with psychosocial disability, phase down of the large congregate settings and the replacement of them with contemporary and inclusive forms of supported housing that are recovery orientated, and potentially also deliver more integrated approaches to that complex care coordination and discharge planning that's needed. And then we've also got the the design of foundational psychosocial disability supports outside the NDIS, which is where there's, I think, risks and opportunities with supports currently being provided by the NDIS being pushed outside the NDIS, but then also the opportunity that those supports could provide more of what's needed. So potentially there's opportunities there for tenancy sustainment that combines psychosocial and more traditional tenancy sustainment support for people who need that to sustain a home. There's also the opportunity that could expand the mental health expertise capacity in homelessness services, which currently is very scarce, that there would be mental health experts involved in delivering homelessness supports. There's some bright spots for that, but it's not widespread. So then we've also got the upcoming National Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Strategy, which provides the basis for an agreement between federal and state governments on foundational psychosocial supports, and could help resolve some of the gaps and lack of connections between those different siloed service delivery areas like homelessness, mental health and disability. Third area is that there's work underway to strengthen the regulatory environment and the oversight of group accommodation settings, and to give greater voice and choice to residents living in these environments. So I think what we would call for in that space is the implementation of the NDIS Quality and Safeguard Commission's own motion inquiry into supported accommodation, and for state and territory governments to adhere to a national framework for regulation and consumer protection, which reflects the recommendations in the Disability Royal Commission. So, and then we've also got the upcoming National Housing and Homelessness Plan, which is an opportunity for government to focus on delivering supported housing and housing supports for people living with psychosocial disability. That's a big challenge and opportunity. We just over the weekend got a new Minister for Housing and Homelessness who will hopefully take a more ambitious approach to that national plan. The next steps for us are about fine-tuning that the opportunities that I've talked about and a set of policy recommendations. So we're working on a paper which we can share as it comes available. But the next step is also about working in coalition, not just across housing and homelessness sectors, but also with our colleagues in health, mental health and NDIS. And this conversation today is a part of the process of building those linkages. So it's great to see you all here participating. So yesterday I was really pleased to meet with the CEO of Mental Health Australia, who's our counterpart national peak in the mental health sector, and to get the ball rolling on those kinds of conversations that sit across the sector silos. And going forward, I encourage you to continue your advocacy for the changes that we need to achieve more supported housing, because now is really the moment to seize with all this reform happening. And I also invite you to stay connected with Homelessness Australia in this work so we can work together and I'll share information after the session. So keep an eye out on email with all of the content. So thanks again to all our partners in the event. Thanks to Elroy, thanks to Council to Homeless Persons, thanks to all our speakers, to Lisa, Elroy again, to Neil Turton Lane, to Mark, Tanya and Daniel. It's been a fantastic conversation. Thanks to everyone for coming along and participating. And let's hope that over this period we can achieve the outcomes that we need to. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate.